Well, this presentation is going to be a bit about Oneida history and federal policies that have impacted the nations across the United States. And where I wanted to start with was this this slide right here that has to do with assimilation, acculturation, and colonization. And this is the process of securing the spiritual, political, and economical and social control of a group of people and their lands. That's what that is. And why I bring that up is because when we look at the mindset of the Europeans when they first came here, there were these two documents that were in effect at that time when Columbus came here. The first one is the doctrine of discovery, and what this states is that European nations have the authority to forcibly acquire and inhabit lands in the name of their sovereign government. And this was usually the kings and queens of that time. So by force, they had that authority to do that, no matter what the people are. The right of conquest was another legal doctrine that it states that European nations assume sovereign rights and title to any of its conquered lands. So once they conquered, then they assumed the title of that land. So this was the mindset of the Europeans when they came here. And that's what they did all over the world until they came here. Nobody knew that this Turtle Island, part of Turtle Island, existed. And so when they went back, after Columbus went back, what they posed a question to the Pope at that time was whether or not we're human. A very fundamental question, because there's a whole race of people here that nobody ever knew existed. And so all the bishops and the Pope, they had a big meeting about it at the Vatican, and they came up with this. It's the Pius Fidelium Papal Bull. And there's a ton of these Papal Bulls that have come out of the Vatican over the years. And what this states, Pope Alexander VI was the Pope at that time, and this was what came out of that meeting, that states that new lands could be colonized only if the indigenous habitants could be converted to Christianity. So those other two doctrines, conquest, now they're saying that because the Vatican and the leaders of those times, they almost like slept together. They didn't do something without the other's approval. And so what this does is it sets a precedent, and that it establishes the church's divine right and authority to Christianize the world. And this is still in effect today. This is still in effect. And so when they came here, the ones that met with the indigenous people weren't the soldiers and everything. It was the clergy. So every one of those ships that came across, there was a clergy that was there that would be the one that would approach, the inhabitants, and begin to attempt to Christianize, our people. So this went on for, I guess, a number of years, but obviously that didn't work out, because a lot of our indigenous people didn't want to be Christianized, and as their populations began to grow and grow, there was a lot of land confrontations, people squatting on our territories and stuff, and a lot of wars began to break out within the different colonies that began to set up, establish themselves. Our first contact was in 1611. That was the very first contact that we had, and it was the French. And they had allied themselves with the Hurons and laid siege on our village. And so our people never really had anything or wanted anything to do with the French because of that. The first treaty that was ever signed with a European nation wasn't until 1613 with the Five Nations, the Five Nations Confederacy. So that's the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. And this was done with the Dutch. And what this document did is establish the premises for all future treaties of the sovereignty of the 5 nations and other European countries. And the picture is where our wampum comes from. This is a depiction of that wampum belt that was done at that time. And the mentality that the Europeans had was that we were like children to them. But our people never looked at it that way. And this is where it was stated that we're like brothers, we're equals. And these 2 lines on here, one represents our path. They look at it as like the river of life. And the other one represents the Europeans. And on that one path, or that they look at it as a river, is the European and their ship, and everything within that. So that's how they govern themselves, how they function socially, economically, as well as culturally. And then in our canoe is everything about our whole cosmology. Our culture, how we function socially, economically, and politically. And that they're to never intersect, and they're never to interfere for eternity. And that was the premise. And so it established that sovereignty, that we're equal to these nations that came across the ocean. And so, about 3 years ago, they had a reenactment of that. There's a group that went from Onondaga Nation, and they canoed. It took them 2 weeks to get down to New York, and they met down at the United Nations. They did a reenactment of that, and they went down there and they presented this treaty, to all those nations that were assembled at that time. So it's still something that our people look at in terms of, that we are sovereign, to this day. Okay. But, as history turns out, is that the clergy continued to infiltrate into our territories and to begin to convert our people over to Christianity. And by 1702, this was when the first church was built in our territory in New York. And so now we begin the factionalization of our nation. And so we have a faction of our people converting over to Christianity. The thing about that 2-world wampum belt there too is the governance. And how that 5 nations was created goes back over 2,000 years when a peacemaker came here. And one of the things that they talk about inside of that is that people can believe in any kind of spirituality. Because we have a history of bringing whole nations in and adopting them and them becoming us. But some of them would retain some of their culture, like their spirituality, maybe their ceremonies or something. And what the Great Law, what that says in there is that that's okay, because the Creator did that all over the world. He gave every group of ethnic people all over the world a different way of practicing their beliefs, their spirituality. And so when the church came into our territories and the clergy came into our territories, they weren't so close-minded about that, and it was okay. But the line that was drawn is the governance. That there is, if our people were to convert over to that, they don't really have the authority to start making land deals or things like that with the European nations. It's only our traditional government that has that authority. And so that's why our people were so open to that, especially the 5 nations. And so as time goes on, more and more of the Iroquois nations, as well as the Algonquins who were along the Atlantic seaboard there, New England states, began to become Christianized. And by the time the Revolutionary War comes along, the 6 nations, by now it's called the 6 Nations because the Tuscaroras, they got kind of evicted out of their territories in the Carolinas, and they sought refuge in our territory. And that's one of the roles of the Oneidas, was to like host them. So they came into our territory, we put land aside for them. Then other nations as well, the Stockbridge, the Brothertons, the Munsee, they're having the same problems. There's a lot of conflict going on with land. The population is getting more and more of the non-natives, and they're losing their territories. And so they came in our territory, the Tuscaroras, so then they start calling us the Six Nations Confederacy. And during this whole time, prior to the Revolutionary War, leading up to that, the 13 colonists were vying for the Six Nations allegiance, to side with them. The British at the same time was doing the same thing. They had agents that would come in and bring goods, and trinkets and all that kind of stuff, and try to butter them up and this and that. And so they were, there was even interracial marriages that were going on at that time to solidify those relationships. And the Oneidas in particular sided with the 13 colonists. The other nations sided with the British. But the Grand Council, the Chiefs' Council, the 50 chiefs from those 5 nations, they call it Grand Council, when they met on this here, what they put out there was that, and what they told the British and they told the 13 colonists is that this is not our problem, this is your problem, this is your fight, and we have nothing to do with it. And so we're going to remain neutral. But by this time here, the men, the warriors, were kind of like gaining like authority, notoriety in fights and stuff, because there's many other wars that went on before this. And so they told them that we didn't have any control over our men, and whatever they decide to do, that's their own doing. But officially we're remaining neutral. So most of the men from the Mohawks, the Onondagas and Senecas in particular, they sided with the British. And so during this war here, it split the nations. So we're talking about almost 1,800 years, these 5 nations lived together in harmony, And now this war here has split them. And even within the nations, there were factions of Oneidas that fought with the British. There were factions of Onondagas that fought with the 13 colonists. And so there's a story in there, in one of the battles that went on, is that 2 brothers, one on each side, one fought with the 13 colonists and one fought with the British. They were at the same battle at the same time, and they were fighting each other. But it was a different person killed, the one that was fighting with the British. His brother wasn't the one that killed him. But that's how it got to be. So you talk about how split our people became because of this here. And to put more salt to the wound, General Sullivan went through our territories, the Six Nations territories, and laid siege on the homelands, the interior of New York State. And there was our people, the Oneidas, were the ones that were the scouts that brought them into there. Because this was the interior of New York, and there wasn't hardly any, there's maybe just a couple of outposts on the outskirts, but in the interior there was none, there was no natives whatsoever. But because our people knew that territory, we led General Sullivan into that territory. And George Washington was the one who authorized that. And it was in the summertime, right around green corn time, and they just totally destroyed everything. General Sullivan kept a diary, and I read that diary, and it talks about the millions of bushels of corn that was destroyed, the livestock, the fields of corn, the orchards, the homes, the villages, everything was totally destroyed. It was burned. It was a genocidal attempt on our people. And why they were able to do that was because most of the warriors were gone, up there with the British. 1779. Now after the war, Congress is starting, the federal government now is starting to assert their authority, and up until this time, any individual and or state could make a treaty with indigenous people for land secessions. And what the federal government attempted to do, was to eliminate that, and that only the federal government now could establish treaties with individual nations. And so the Non-Intercourse Act of 1793 was passed by Congress that forbid any state or individual from acquiring indigenous lands without federal consent. And then the very next year, at the Canandaigua Treaty in 1794, this was done with the Six Nations and the federal government, an agent that George Washington sent to this treaty. And what it did was that it reaffirms our independence, our sovereignty, and land base of the Six Nations Confederacy. From that time on, from 1795 to 1846, New York State in particular made 26 treaties with the Oneidas, which virtually acquired all 6 million acres of our homelands in New York State. Within a 50-year period, we lost everything. Which is why we ended up out here. And this is a picture of New York, and this is where the 6 million acres is. It doesn't include land that our people went down into Pennsylvania as well, into Canada as well. Because there's even archaeological digs that are done like around where Oneida is today at the Thames, of Iroquois villages, And so our people went up into it. There was no boundaries back then, but it's just within the state of New York. And so from then on, after the treaty era, what happened in 1795 was he's what they call Handsome Lake. He's a Seneca. Now every one of those 5 nations, the original ones, they have a principal chief. Like we have 9, Mohawks have 9, Onondagas have 10. No, they have 14. Cayugas have 10, and Senecas have 8. And in the story of how that came to be, at that time we're at war over 2,000 years ago, and the most fierce and wretched men on the face of the earth were the leaders at that time. And when the peacemaker came, he was able to convince them to turn that around and become the best that they could be. And they became the ones that the peacemaker targeted because they were the most feared. And some were sorcerers as well as cannibals. And this title here, that's Scunna de Leo, what they call Handsome Lake, he was the principal chief for the whole Seneca Nation. And by this time here, 1795, he was an alcoholic. And his mother was Longhouse, his father was a priest. So that's the home he grew up in. And what the church, what that did, it kind of like looked down at our ways. It was even, this is during the time here too, just prior to that, during the Plains Indians War, it was illegal for us to practice our ceremonies because of what was going on in the Plains states with the Lakota people, the Plains Indians, all the warring that was going on out there. They had this kind of like a resurgence out there, of those Plains Indians coming together, uniting, and fighting against the army and protecting their homelands. And because of that, from that there was this ghost dance that they talk about, and that was the the kind of like the coming together, because they all had that within their nations. And so the church also kind of like, what do you call it, condoned, not condoned, what's the opposite? Opposed, any of our ways. Our ways were looked at as being inferior. And even to the point that they were saying that we're devil worshippers. And in our culture, we don't have a concept of a devil. That's not in our culture at all. That's something that came across the ocean. And so Handsome Lake, by this time here, he was an alcoholic. And that was another big tool that was used to kind of like to, I guess, oppress our people, was the alcohol. And it was a big, big problem even prior to the war, even prior to all the treaties that were going on. And there was a lot of unscrupulous dealings that were done with the alcohol, you know. And inside of this story here, it talks about that, because it talks about what the non-natives were doing when they would come to trade. The first thing they would do is give them liquor, get them feeling good and drunk. And then when they would barter all their hides, you know, what they would barter for mostly was just barrels and barrels of liquor. And then, you know, chaos would break out. And so inside of this here, for 4 years he's sick because of that alcoholism. And there's a point in there where he dies. And inside of there is when they talk about when these messengers, these spirits came to him. And they talked to him, and they said, because that very last year he was like an imbecile. He couldn't take care of himself. His daughter took care of him and everything. And all he could do was just, you know, pray and talk to creation. He would do that every morning, give thanks. And every night, give thanks again. You know, that's the old school. That's the original teachings there. That we're to do that all the time, always be grateful. And what happened was that when he died, those spirits came to him and they asked him, well, what it is that you want, you know. And so this guy here, he says, I want to ask for forgiveness because I sing Oniholu. Oniholu is one of the 4 sacred ceremonies that we have. It's a Thanksgiving ceremony that we dance and we sing, and there's a speech that goes with it at the same time. You know, that goes back way before the peacemaker, you know, towards the beginning of time. And that's what the Creator gave to our people, the Haudenosaunee people. And it's a sacred ceremony. And here he is, principal chief for the Seneca Nations. He's asking for forgiveness for singing those sacred songs. So you think about that, the mindset, the indoctrination that's been going on of our stuff not being negative, you know. And then they say, well, there's something else we want to hear. And so he says, well, I want to ask for forgiveness for singing Okiwe. Okiwe is like our ghost dance that was going on out in the plains. But it's ours, how we do it. And those are ceremonial songs as well. It's to honor our ancestors, is to always remind us that of our past, our roots. You know, it actually goes all the way back to the sky world. And they tell them, no, continue to do that. Just like the Oniholu, continue to do that. Encourage your people. That's what the Creator gave to your people as a way of giving thanks. Then he said, there's something else we want to hear. So then he says, I want to ask for forgiveness for drinking Ohnega. Ohnega is liquor. And they said, that's what we want to hear. And so, for 16 years, those messengers came to him, and they showed him all these things, all the impacts, all the influence that came across the ocean, and how that's going to affect our people. How it's going to divide us, how it's going to make us forget who we are, everything, our language, and all the things that came over. The education, the alcohol, the cards, the music, and all that stuff there is going to change our people. It's going to divide us to where, you know, we're going to forget who we are as people. So it was a revitalization too of our ways, our traditional ways, to bring those things back up, you know. And so very, very important time in our history, because it revitalized our people, you know, of our ways. But also made it real clear of the things that came across the ocean, and if we go too far into those things there, we're going to get lost, you know. So we still hear that to this day. So the churches are still doing their things. By 1809, there's another faction of our people who become Methodists. So now we have 3 groups of people. We have the traditional people, the Episcopalians, and the Methodists. So our people become, you know, factionalized. And as we continue on, with all the land dealing that was going on, losing our homelands and stuff here, Eleazar Williams was instrumental in bringing our people here. And he was actually being paid by the federal government. And he met with George Washington. And he was encouraged to have all of our people move west of the Mississippi. That was the thought of this time, was to remove all indigenous people and take them west of the Mississippi, to open up all of that land. And Because one of the things that went on when that treaty at Canandaigua, there were land secessions that went on with all 5 nations. And the reason being is because all of those 13 colonist men that fought in that war, they were guaranteed 100 acres each if they fought in that war. But they didn't have any land, so they had to do this treaty. And a big reason why we lost a lot of land as well. So in 1822, well 1820, there was a delegation that came out here and met with the Menominees and the Ho-Chunk, or the Winnebagos they called back then, for a land deal. The Ho-Chunks didn't want to do it, they backed out. The Menominees stayed, and they worked out a deal for joint use of 8.5 million acres. That's the green. Goes all the way down to Milwaukee, west of Wausau, up to Escanaba. For joint use of that. And so in 1822, the first group of Oneidas came here. And that's, we settled originally more to the, well, right where it is now, I guess. What do you call Site 1. And how we got here was by boat. In 1815, Governor Clinton created a ditch, a canal, and it connected the Hudson River up to the Mohawk Valley River into the interior of New York. And this was like super duper highway of that time. And so they were able to get go through that Erie Canal over to Buffalo and get on ships, and they brought us here. And after that, the next group that came, the very next year, and it was in the fall time after the harvest, the second Christian party, the Methodists. So just over 650 came here. Now we got the Indian Removal Act. So this is what was brewing prior to us coming out here, and President Andrew Jackson is the one that authorized that. You know, the most infamous one is the Cherokee Nation. They rounded up 20,000 Cherokees and marched them on foot. 5,000 died on the way there. That's why they call it the Trail of Tears. But it wasn't just them, it was also other nations. The Potawatomis went through the same thing, you know. The Ho-Chunk were also rounded up and marched off. Many different nations. This one here, 1831, this treaty here, reduced that 8.5 million acres down to 500,000 acres. So on the map, that's the orange area. So this is Highway 29 right here. Here's the Wolf River. So this is the Menominee present-day Menominee Reservation up here. So it reduced that to 500,000 acres. And there was no representation from the Oneida Nation at that treaty. It was just the Menominees and the federal agent that made that agreement. And I always tell Loretta, says, there's our land claims right there. Reduced to 500,000. It took until 1834 for Congress to pass a law that forbid the sale of alcohol to Indians. This was something that was always being, letters were always being sent to Washington, to the presidents, because of the devastation that alcohol was doing to our people. The only thing about this is it became a federal policy, but there was no enforcement, you know. There was no enforcement of it, you know. And as we go on, 1838, this is the treaty that established our boundaries that we have today. And this was over in New York, and we had representation there. And at that time, there were 654 Oneidas living here. And what the government, what they agreed to was that every individual would be, it wasn't given individually to each one, but they were allotted 100 acres. So it became 65,400 acres. The other 26 acres was added on after because there was a tribal member that had cleared this big property, and when they, you know, did the survey of the reservation, his was outside it, so they added that on, extra 26 acres. But it wasn't held individually. It was still held communal. That's how it's always been. And culturally, it's the women that own the land. So 8.5 million, half an acre, or half a million, and then down to the 65,426 acres. Now, even within the church, there was a division. Because in 1840, 200 from the Episcopal Church, what they did is they purchased 5,000 acres from the British Crown. And this was the money that we paid the monopolies was from the land successions that we made in New York. And the same with this faction of Oneidas, the money that they paid the British Crown for that was from the land successions that they made. So 200 left and went up there in the fall of 1840, and they did the same route. They got on those barges and the boat, and went up into what was known as this wasn't Canada yet. There was no Wisconsin when we came here either. That came way later. And so they did the same thing, got on barges, and then they went over to there. And they have a story of those barges that the federal government, lined up for them were so rickety that when on the way there, they had to repair that ship, otherwise it would have sunk. And it did sink when it didn't make it back. It sunk on the way back to Buffalo. The next year, within the Methodist Church, again, there was a division. 160 from that faith. In 1841, in the fall, they migrated to what is southwest Ontario as well, and did the same thing by boat. The last group that came here to the Northwest Territory was the Orchard Party, and these were the traditional people. They weren't affiliated with any church. They still continued to practice our ceremonies, and 44 came here. And then the next year, or a couple years later, the last group to leave our territories, 1845. This was the year that the treaty era ended with the Oneidas. That was the last treaty that was made with the state of New York in 1845 for land secession. And this was also the traditional faction, 28, very, very small. Almost 12,000, over 1,200 Oneidas left New York State in this era here. When we talk about the acculturation, the assimilation process, the Oneidas were one of the first native tribes to adopt an elected form of government. Up until this time, even when I talked about those chiefs, those political and spiritual leaders, there was one that came here. He was from the Turtle Clan. The rest of those went up into New York, or up into Canada. So we were one of the very first governments to do that. So now it's continuously acculturating. We're abandoning our spirituality traditionally. We're abandoning our clan system, our chiefs, our clan mothers, and now we're electing our people, our leaders. This year probably had the most devastation to our culture, to our language, was the boarding schools. Captain Pratt was the superintendent. He was in the Army. He was a prison guard during the Plains Indians Wars at a federal prison that held Native Americans. Geronimo was one of them that was in that down in Florida. And he came up with the idea of starting a boarding school to acculturate, the Native Americans. The school motto was kill the Indian and save the man. So kill everything about them. And it's the children that they targeted. Take their language away, take their songs away, take their ceremonies away, take their history away, and teach them Yankee Doodle. Teach them how to read and write, forbid them from speaking their language. And they were taken, 5, 6 years old off the reservation, forced. This wasn't something, we signed up for. This was forced. This was a federal policy. and shipped them off to these boarding schools. And when they left, they never came back in the summertime. They stayed out there. It was a functioning farm. That first school, Carlisle, it was a functioning farm. And so they went to school half a day and they worked that farm. And when the boys got older, they were taught, different types of trades, either to be like a farmer, to be a carpenter, to be a blacksmith, those kinds of things. The women, the girls, are taught how to sew, to cook, to clean, and things like that. Eroding of our sovereignty, the Federal Major Crimes Act, 1885, and the federal government said that Native American governments do not have authority or jurisdiction to deal with crimes declared a felony by federal statutes, and that the federal government now has taken over that responsibility. It was just done across the board. We didn't have any say in it. So now, when things was going on here, like on our reservation, there's a lot of stories of hangings. Somebody killed somebody, they were tried, they were hung. That was it, eye for an eye. And so now, when that happens, then now they got sent down to Milwaukee at the federal court down there at that time, and that's where they were tried. Later on, Green Bay, had the federal court. So eroding of their sovereignty. Dawes Allotment Act, another one that was a direct attack at tribal sovereignty. Federal statutes says that in order for a tribe to be sovereign, they have to have a culture, they have to have a language, they have to have a government, they have to have a land base. All four of these were attacked directly by federal policies, and this Dawes Allotment Act was an attack on our land base. And so in 1891, it was allotted out. Every adult head of household got 90 acres, and if you're a woman head of your household, you didn't get 90, you got 45. See, women didn't have a voice then, even with the United States government. Everyone under 21 got 26 acres. So if you look at a family of 5, mom and dad and 3 kids, you got over 200 acres of land. And the idea was then that after 25 years, this land was now going to be taxable. So tax was brought into the reservation. And each church got 40 acres of property. So that Norbert Hill building and the woods behind it and across the road, that was the 80 acres for the church. The school. 80 acres was set aside for the school. That was the 80 acres that was set aside for the school. If you look at it nationally, it was estimated that 138 million acres was owned by indigenous nations at this time. And what this did was that it reduced it to 48 million. 90 million acres was just taken away and given the federal government assumed responsibility or ownership of that land. It's about the size of South and North Dakota combined. That's how much land was lost from this here. So a 25-year stipulation, educate the Native Americans what taxation is, and then each individual is allotted a piece of land. And if you look at the map, these are these squares right here, the bigger ones like this here, those are the 90 acres. But some of these are so small, there's some on here that are only about 4 acres, some are only 3 acres. So individuals, their allotment was subdivided, and they're scattered all over the reservation. Most of along the creek is where our people settled. And this whole area up here in the northwest, that was the great big swamp. And you can see how subdivided a lot of that is. So families were it was intentionally done this way to divide our people. You can't make a living in a swamp if you got 90 acres in a swamp. There's no way to do that. And so by 1889, the Assimilative Crime Act, and this here, again, erosion of tribal sovereignty, is that any federal offenses committed on reservations that are not covered under specific federal statutes but punishable under state statutes are now tried in federal court. So domestic abuse, things like that, we don't have that. Our leaders don't have authority to try them anymore. So they would go to the state, Green Bay, and be tried. This was an attachment to the Dawes Allotment Act, and what this was to expedite the land secession. And so here, there's the 25-year clause there, which could be circumvented. And individual can go down to the court, Green Bay, and be deemed competent, and then now he can sell his land prior to that 25-year period. I'd like to see the numbers on that, because it's all recorded down at Brown County Courthouse, how many of our people were deemed competent. By 1927, 99% of the reservation is gone. A big part of that reason, a big reason because of it, because our people, once the 25-year period is over, now we have some equity. We have a land base, but we have to pay taxes on that. So people started taking loans out, to pay on that or to build a house on it. And when they couldn't pay it, and the value of the property equaled what they owed the bank, or in taxes, or the cumulative of those, they were evicted. And a lot of our people got evicted. 1910, the counties came in and divided the reservation in half. The different townships also started cutting their piece of the pie as well. So we're divided into 9 different township villages and cities, the reservation. Innocent Indian Citizenship Act. After the World War I, there was a very high percentage of Native Americans that fought in that war, and so there was a push to make them American. We weren't considered Americans, You were of whatever nation you were, But the government, said, okay, now all you Native Americans, you're American, so this is why we have dual citizenship. Now, in defiance of that, what our people did here, 1925, there was a delegation from Onondaga that came here, and they condoled, they held what they call a condolence ceremony. And what that is when a chief dies, they have to have this ceremony to install a new one. They installed 9 chiefs, 9 clan mothers, and 9 sub-chiefs at this ceremony. And to me, that's saying, no, I'm not American, I'm Oneida. And this is the governance that our people always had for over 2,000 years. And so, so there's always been, a faction of our people that hung on to this here, our traditional people. And then as we continue to go through Indian Reorganization Act, this is a direct attack on our traditional sovereignty, our traditional governments. And our people adopted that in 1937. This is where blood quantum comes in today that we're faced with. That was the stipulation in there. Some nations say if you do lineage, you're Cherokee. So they got all the names of the 15,000 Cherokees that made it over to the Kansas Claim area. And if you can prove lineage to one of those people, you're Cherokee. What the Oneidas did, well, 1/4. And today we have 17,000 Oneidas, half of them are 1/4. And that's because of this. So it's an attack at our sovereignty. There were 77 nations across the United States that didn't adopt it. So they still have their traditional form of governance. Termination Act, prior to this year, Congress did a survey, the Merriam Report, and went across the United States and did a reality test of the conditions of tribes, of reservations. There were some that were functioning. They're doing okay, like the Menominees, they had that mill, they were doing good. So they were targeted, all those nations, and they were terminated with federal recognition. And all their lands were put into, became taxable. And Public Law 280, this again was the federal government giving the states authority had to have jurisdictions within the reservation boundaries. Menominees are excluded from this because when this became law, they weren't even Menominee. They weren't indigenous. They weren't considered indigenous because they had to petition Congress to with the Restoration Act to be recognized again as a federal, have that federal relationship with the United States government. And so local and state police, whatever, they don't have any jurisdiction on the Menominee Reservation. It's only the federal marshals. Indian Relocation Act, another federal policy to get Indians off the reservation and into mainstream USA. My family, we ended up in Texas. I was about 2 years old, and we stayed there for about 6 months, and we came back. But this was a contract, and a lot of people never did come back. I still have an aunt that's still down there. And because of that, over half of the Native population reside in urban areas today. 1976, bingo operation begins here on the res, an assertion of our sovereignty. They tried to shut it down and went to court and everything. Yep, okay, you can have bingo. And that began to escalate to what we have today. 1978, Indian Religious Freedom Act. Now it's legal for us to have ceremonies, to practice our ways. But it doesn't protect sacred sites. And Native peoples all over the United States have them. We have them back in our homelands, sites that were sacred to us. And Indian Child Welfare Act, again, gave some authority back to local tribal governments because it was customary for families that had a lot of alcoholism and stuff. Social service would come in and remove the kids, and then 9 times out of 10 they ended up being adopted out. And so a lot of people, have been coming back, especially the last 20 years, 20, 30 years, finding out that they were adopted out as a kid, and I know a family that ended up in South Carolina, and her dad was a neighbor of mine, and they were winos. I never knew they had kids. And here, her and her sister got adopted out. And they came back and they found out who their family was and everything. So there was a lot of that was going on. We see it all the time at Culture Heritage, people coming back. This is the reservation today. It's probably up to over 25,000 now. This is from a year ago. The red is the land that's held in trust. When we adopted IRA, the government we have today, what the federal government is, they bought back about 1,200 acres of land. It's kind of scattered all over, and it was put into trust. It's held in their name. It's not held in Oneida's name. It's held in federal trust. And so, as we're buying the land back, especially with the gaming compact, there's all these stipulations in there. And one of them is that if we can put land back into trust. And so that's all the red. And right down here is brown. The line. This is Brown County. This is Allegheny County. This is Oneida, the town of Oneida. And you can see that most of the land is in the town of Oneida. And, Hobart's over here. Not much, and then there's Green Bay up there. Not a whole lot. And so that's a big issue today. Is that they just had in the Gully Week or Press Gazette a couple of days ago a big article about that, and that they don't want to do that no more. And they're hooking up. Even Hobart is hooking up with them too now. So that's one of the stipulations in the gaming compact. Is that we have these service agreements, and there's a lot of money that is exchanged with all those counties and townships that are within the reservation boundaries, so that we can reclaim our reservation. But most of the Hobart and Green Bay are really starting to dig their heels in about that. Ta-da!